Good afternoon. And much like this morning, I'm back in the role of interrupting good conversations, so I apologize. For those of you whom I have not met, my name is Dan Parrish. I'm the director of the Dartmouth for Life program in the Office of Alumni Relations at Dartmouth College. And if you're trying to figure out what Dartmouth for Life means, I work with the team of folks who plan lifelong educational programs here in Hanover, across the country, around the world, online. We take faculty members to great places and put them together with alumni and parents and friends of the college and get involved in conversations like the one we're going to have this afternoon. Many thanks to those of you who joined us this morning with Randall Balmer and his lecture about Jimmy Carter. It was a lot of fun to hear questions, and my takeaway was that Jimmy Carter was the first president born in a hospital, which was a great trivia question. So now I have good cocktail party fodder. This afternoon's conversation will take us in a different direction, and I'm very, very excited to welcome the folks who are here to lead our conversation this afternoon. In a minute, I'm going to introduce Dan Lucy, who's a member of the Dartmouth class of 77 and the Geisel School of Medicine, or as we used to say, Dartmouth Medical School class of 81. I want to first just thank the Ethics Institute and Anya Donovan for helping promote and sponsor today's event, and I especially want to thank Dan Lucy because he has been a driving force behind trying to find a home for the conversation about wisdom in the alumni community and at the college. And this is our second iteration of this conversation here on campus. We did this last year as well, and it's been a lot of fun to meet folks who have this interest in this conversation about wisdom, to connect with them and to see the conversation continue throughout the year. So I am going to hand things off to Dan Lucy so that he can introduce this afternoon's speakers. Dan has recently returned from Sierra Leone and wants you to know that he's been in the country for more than 21 days, so he is healthy and well. And in 9 days, he is headed to Liberia to continue working with healthcare professionals who are on the front lines of the Ebola fight. And Dan has been involved in this work for many years, not just in the last 6 months since it's been on the sort of front of the news pages. So I'll hand things off to Dan Lucy, and thanks again for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dan Parrish, for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone who's here today. We understand it's a very busy time for you this weekend, and we are honored to have you here. And we look forward to your comments and questions after our two presenters. There'll be about a half an hour for dialogue and discussion. So we have two wonderful speakers today, Professor Ken Sharpe and Dr. Joseph O'Donnell, and I'll just briefly introduce both of them, one right after the other, and then Ken will speak first and then Joe second. Professor Ken Sharpe is a Dartmouth class of 1966. He teaches at Swarthmore College, political philosophy. He's taught at several other institutions across the country on practical wisdom and on ethics and political philosophy. He's written at least 4 books, one of which I highly recommend to you. It's called Practical Wisdom: The Right Way to Do the Right Thing. He's a co-author with Barry Schwartz, and he'll be talking on this topic, obviously, here today. Ken has also taught for many years at Dartmouth, as well as at Swarthmore. In the 80s and 90s, he taught in the Masters of Arts and Liberal Studies, MALS program that was championed, if you will, by a well-known English professor here, Donald Pease, who is with us here last year at this event, but is in New York City at a special lecture that his wife is giving today, so he can't join us today. But I should also mention that Donald Pease wrote a book about Theodore Geisel, class of 1925, after whom the medical school has now been renamed. So in addition to Ken's many accomplishments and his teaching, he spent this whole last year here on campus in the Ethics Institute with Professor Donovan, as mentioned. And he worked also with Dr. Joe O'Donnell over this past year. So we're very, very happy to have Ken here with us today. Well, I just met Ken an hour ago. I've known Joe since 1978, when I was a first-year medical student here at Dartmouth after graduating from the college. Joe was my mentor, my advisor, my role model, during medical school and for many years afterwards. He's the first person I came to 3 years ago when I had this idea that really came to me repeatedly in the middle of the night. It wasn't quite like Jacob and the angels, but there was something like that where this one word kept coming to my mind at 3 in the morning. That was wisdom. And I wasn't sure who to talk with about that, so first I went and talked with Joe. And he encouraged me to pursue it if I felt so compelled to do so. And he's encouraged me and participated in the presentation last year and again this year, and has talked with many colleagues at the medical center at the college on my behalf and for everyone's behalf, because that's really what this idea of practical wisdom and can it be taught is really all about. So Joe is now the Senior Advising Dean for Medical Students at the Geisel School of Medicine. He's also the Elizabeth DeCamp McCarney Professor of Medicine and the successor to the former Surgeon General of the United States, C. Everett Koop, here at the Koop, what was called the Koop Institute at Dartmouth. Joe has been a leader and a mentor to now decades of medical students far beyond myself. He went to medical school here at Dartmouth and then at Harvard, came back and did his medical training here, then went to the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute, as he's an oncologist, cancer specialist, and then came back to Dartmouth around 78 and has been here, fortunately, for Dartmouth ever since. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ken Sharpe and Dr. Joseph O'Donnell.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, the two Dans have done some of the thank yous I was going to do, though I wanted to thank both of them for making this possible. I also wanted to thank the John Templeton Foundation that's been kindly funding my research here for the last year, and also the generosity of Anya Donovan and the Ethics Institute for putting up with me for a year. We all need practical wisdom. We need it not just because it's a nice thing to have, but we need it to do our work well, to lead happy and flourishing lives. Practical wisdom is the capacity to do the right thing in the right way. It's not simply learning the principles that professors teach in ethics classes to students so they can pass exams. It's actually knowing the right thing to do in the gray and complex and ambiguous circumstances of our everyday lives. But it's more than just the knowledge. It's also having the habits, the will to actually do the right thing. And you can't act the right way if you just have the cognitive knowledge. You have to be the kind of person that acts well. Aristotle called practical wisdom phronesis, and there's a lovely picture that I have often show to my classes that many of you may know from having taken an art history class. It's by Raphael, and it's the picture that you usually learn when they're showing you how perspective was first used, right? As opposed to what the content is. But if you look closely in the center, it's called the School of Athens, and in the center actually of the picture, right where the perspective points come together, are Plato and Aristotle. And it's pretty interesting. This is Plato here on the left, right? They're talking about wisdom, and Plato is pointing up to the heavens, where he sees the source of knowledge, the so-called Platonic forms. But Aristotle, his student, who's walking next to him, has his hand out, and we suppose he is saying to Plato, no, the really interesting and important questions about wisdom aren't up there, they're down here, where we're leading our everyday lives. And that's where he comes up with the term phronesis as practical wisdom. The important question, he said to his students, and giving them one example, the important question about anger, he said, isn't whether anger is good or bad. It's the practical wisdom to know when to be angry and how to be angry. And how to be angry at the right person, in the right way, for the right amount of time, and for the right reasons. And then doing it. Let's take as an example Luke. Luke is a hospital custodian, one of a group studied by a team of psychologists led by Amy Resniewski. Luke reported an incident in which he cleaned the room of a comatose patient twice in the same hour. Why? Here's Luke speaking to the interviewer. I kind of knew the situation about his son. His son had been here for a long time, and from what I hear, his son had got into a fight, and he was paralyzed, in a coma. He had got into a fight with a black guy, and the black guy really, I went and cleaned his room. His father would stay there every day, all day, but he had went out to smoke a cigarette. And after I cleaned the room, I ran into the father in the hall, and he just freaked out. He was yelling at me. He was telling me I didn't clean the room and all this stuff. And at first, I got on the defensive, and I was going to argue with him. But I don't know, something caught me, and I said, I'm sorry, I'll go clean the room. So the interviewer asks Luke somewhat incredulously, and you cleaned it again? Luke, yeah, I cleaned it so that he could see me clean it. I can understand how he could be. It was like 6 months that his son was here. He'd be a little frustrated, so I cleaned it again. But I wasn't angry with him. I guess I could understand. So what are we to make of Luke's decision to clean the room again, and graciously, without an argument or a fight? It wasn't part of Luke's job description. If you look at the 3-page job description Luke has, it has on it things like wet mop floors and stairways, right? Collect and dispose of soiled linen. But Luke and the other custodians at this Midwestern hospital told the researchers that their official duties were only one part of their real jobs, that their real job was to make the patients and their families feel comfortable, to cheer them up when they were down, to encourage them and divert them from their pain. Luke didn't see himself as a custodian. He saw himself as a hospital custodian, as playing an important role in an institution whose aim was to see to the care and welfare of the patients. I think Aristotle would have admired Luke. First, Luke understood the aims. Aristotle would have said the telos, the purpose, the aims of the institution he worked in, promoting health, curing illness, relieving suffering. Second, Luke had critical character traits. Luke was caring, Luke was compassionate, Luke was empathic. Third, Luke had the practical wisdom to actually do those things. He didn't just feel caring, he had the skill to be caring. He didn't just feel empathic, he had the know-how to listen well. And he also had the skill, the wisdom, to balance 3 quite conflicting ethical principles that were at stake when the father confronted him. Luke could have been honest, good principle, always be honest. Luke could have been honest. He could have told the father, look, buddy, I cleaned the room already. Or Luke could have insisted on justice, another good principle. He could have refused the request and called in his supervisor to mediate. But Luke quickly saw that something else was at stake, comforting the father who was seriously in pain. So Luke framed the issue in terms of a third principle, caring, how to sustain the relationship of this father with this son at this particular trying moment of their lives. Honesty and justice were good things, but they could wait for another day. So how did Luke balance honesty, justice, and caring? Did he follow the methods we professors who teach ethics or decision-making or rational choice give them? No, he didn't first reach for some abstract principle or moral rule. Instead, he told himself a story, a narrative about a patient who had got into a fight, about an upset father who had been visiting him, caring for him for months. This story provided Luke with a frame which enabled him to understand what was happening, to let the anger go, and let him feel that it was the proper thing to do to clean the room. It made sense. Let me tell you another story. This one is about an armed robber, Michael. In his early 20s, Michael held up a taxi cab while brandishing a gun. He took $50. Michael was caught and tried in a Philadelphia court. He was a typical offender, said the judge, Lois Forer, young, black, male, a high school dropout without a job. There was no doubt that Michael was guilty, said Forer, and now she needed to mete out the punishment. She turned to the state's sentencing guidelines. A recent law mandated a 5-year minimum for armed robbery on public transportation. The law seemed clear, at least it seemed clear until Judge Forer looked at the particular circumstances, because Michael, it turned out, wasn't so typical. Yes, he had dropped out of high school, but he'd married his pregnant girlfriend, he'd obtained a high school equivalency diploma, he'd been steadily employed, he and his wife had sacrificed to send their daughter to parochial school, and shortly before the holdup, Michael had lost his job. Depressed, despondent, he'd gone out and had one drink too many. He went out, got a gun, robbed a taxi. Oh, and one more thing Forer discovered, the gun was a toy gun. Judge Forer thought the 5-year sentence was out of whack. She dug out the previous statute which mandated a 2-year sentence for such crimes and also allowed judges to make exceptions. And that's exactly what Judge Forer did. She bent the rule. She sentenced Michael to 11.5 months in county jail, 2 years probation, and restitution of the $50. And she permitted him to work outside the prison during the day to support his family. She wrote, "This was Michael's first offense. No one was harmed. Michael acted under the pressures of unemployment and need. A year-long sentence," she said, "was adequate to convince Michael of the seriousness of his crime." So, how did Judge Forer make her decision? The first thing to notice is how important rules were. The whole court system is built around rules. Robbery is illegal, procedural rules, rules about who can speak, sentencing rules and guidelines. But the second and more interesting thing to notice is that rules and laws are not enough. Rules and laws are not enough. And that's exactly why we need judges. Judge Forer had to balance the punishment with the crime. Judge Forer needed to teach Michael a lesson, but she wanted to enable him to reintegrate back into society and to keep his family intact. So the third thing to notice is that Judge Forer needed practical wisdom to do these things. She had to interpret the rules in the particular circumstances. She had to know how to make exceptions. She had to notice and be able to balance competing aims. That's what good judges do all the time. They exercise good judgment, practical wisdom. And Forer was a good judge. She got it right for Michael. 2 years later, Michael had fully complied with the sentence. He'd successfully completed his term of imprisonment and probation. He'd paid restitution to the taxi driver. He'd returned to his family. He'd obtained steady employment. He had not been rearrested. Of course, it's not just judges and hospital custodians that need practical wisdom to flourish. We all do. Parents need to know when to protect their kids and when to allow them to fall and fail. And those of you who have raised kids know how much judgment and how difficult those decisions are. Spouses need practical wisdom to know things like when and how to fight with each other. The oncologists who deliver bad news need to know what this patient can hear at this moment, what truth to tell and how to balance truth-telling against maintaining hope for the patient that's needed for treatment. Remember poet Emily Dickinson's famous poem, the title of which was "Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant." Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Docs need to do that every day, and it takes practical wisdom to get the angle of that slant right. Even we university teachers need practical wisdom to figure out who to call on in class and how often, when to ask a question and when to tell something to the student, when to challenge a student and when to nurture her, and how to grade. Do we grade on effort, on improvement, on analytical skill, on perseverance? Did he do the readings? So, can practical wisdom be taught? Alas, no. At least not if teaching simply means telling or lecturing, nor can good character be taught. Character and practical wisdom are only learned through experience. That's why we use the word experience often as a synonym for wisdom. If I said to you, Dr. Joe O'Donnell is experienced, what you'd know I meant by that is he's got good judgment. He's a person with practical wisdom. We almost use those words to mean the same thing. But here's the rub. Not all experiences teach wisdom. We learn best when someone has structured the experience so we can learn from it. And since this point is really at the heart of all the rest of my comments, let me just say it again. We need to figure out ways to structure experience so that people can learn wisdom from it. And that leads me to want to make two central points now. The first is that the way our current institutions are currently structured is often disastrous for learning practical wisdom. That's because the Fixit toolkit that most managers carry around in their heads has got just two tools in it: rules and incentives, or rewards and punishments. And an over-reliance on such rules and incentives actually corrodes and destroys the practical wisdom we all need. I can't do this in any detail, but let me give you a few illustrative examples. Let's revisit Judge Forer and Michael's toy gun case. The prosecutor in Michael's toy gun case actually appealed to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania the decision that Judge Forer made. He asked the court to require the 5-year minimum mandated by Pennsylvania law. The court agreed and ordered Judge Forer to resentence Michael to the 5 years. By then, Michael was out. He had a clean record and seemed fully rehabilitated. Judge Forer wrote, "I was faced with a legal and a moral dilemma. As a judge, I had sworn to uphold the law, and I could find no legal grounds for violating a decision by the Supreme Court. Yet, there was no social or criminological justification for sending Michael back to prison. Given the choice between defying a court order or my conscience, I decided to leave the bench where I had sat for 16 years. That, however, did not help Michael. Another judge resentenced him to serve another 4 years and 15 days, and faced with this prospect, Michael disappeared." Well, let's go from the courts to our schools. Let's step inside a second-grade classroom in Chicago and visit Christine Jabari. Ms. Jabari began her 53rd day teaching kindergarten at Chicago's Joyce Kelmer Elementary School with a very clear lesson plan. She picked up the book that all the teachers had been given. She turned to day 53 in the book, along with 26,000 other Chicago teachers who had identical binders crammed with goals and conversation starters and step-by-step questions. And what Ms. Jabari saw when she opened that book, at the top of the page, it said, "Script for day 53." And under that, it said, title, reading and enjoying words with B. Under that, it said text, the bath. Under that, it said lecture, assemble students on the rug or reading area. Give students a warning about the dangers of hot water. Say, listen very quietly as I read the story. Say, think of pictures that make the same sound bath begins with. There followed a list of 75 instructions for teaching the bath. It's probably the case that such lockstep procedures and teaching scripts, like Mr. Jabari was following, actually can help a novice teacher. They give it a give the teacher a kind of initial scaffold, like having training wheels when you learn how to ride a bike. But in school districts all over the United States, those training wheels are welded on. All teachers, novices and experts, are being forced to mindlessly follow such scripts. These teachers are not being given the experience or the discretion to learn how to reflect, to learn how to evaluate their own experiences, to redesign curriculum to fit the circumstances. They're not learning how to improvise. The system is squeezing the wisdom out of teachers, or just plain squeezing the wise teachers out. The other favorite tool managers have in this behavior control kit is even more subtle and pernicious, and that's incentives, rewards. Bribe people with external rewards, a method that any parent or corporate executive often feels forced to use, and we all know that incentives work, at least in the short term. But the problem with incentives is they risk corroding any internal North Star that guides us. There are lots of psychology experiments which show this effect. For example, James Hyman and Don Ariely did an experiment with college students in which they parked a big moving van on a street corner in Palo Alto, and they had a couch sitting next to the moving van. And passersby would come, and the students leading the experiment would just call the passerby over and say, "Listen, could you give us a hand loading this couch into the van?" And almost all the passersby said, "Sure," and loaded the couch into the van. So on succeeding days, they went to other street corners. But this time, as passersby came by, the students said, "Could we give you $20 to help us load this couch into the van?" Far, far fewer people were willing to help when given that choice. They had changed a social transaction into a market transaction. The actual incentive had been corroding, in some sense, to their civic sense. So that's an experiment, a psych experiment. An equivalent to that was actually done in a study, in a real-life study that took place in a daycare center in Israel. The teachers, the daycare teachers, were actually having difficulty getting the parents to come pick up their kids on time. 5 minutes late, 10 minutes late. Parents were busy. Not a lot of parents, just a handful. But the daycare center teachers couldn't go home, right, and leave the 3-year-old on the street corner. So they came up with a brilliant idea. Let's fine the parents a small fine, $25 if they come late, right? Just so they get the idea. So they instituted the $25 fine. And what happened? More parents came late. More parents came late. Why? Because the parents said, "Oh, it's just going to cost us $25 if I'm late. I got a busy phone call, I can pick up some groceries, I got a lot of things to do. $25, it's worth it," right? Gone was any notion that maybe they had a responsibility to the caretakers of their kids, that these people had to get home to their children. So you actually increased the number by incentivizing it. So after 6 months, the school said, "This is nuts. We're stopping this." And what happened when they stopped it is that parent lateness increased again, because now it was free, right? So you can actually change a kind of social transaction, a sense of responsibility, into a moral transaction using those incentives, and you can actually kind of literally corrupt the character of the people in doing that. I could go through lots of major institutions in society and look at examples like this, but I think what I want to stress now and move to conclude with is that despite the kinds of examples at workplaces where these kinds of techniques are used, in every workplace, all of us know people, or maybe some of us have been people like this, people who are actually trying to do the right thing in spite of the bureaucracies and incentives that are arrayed against them. In the research that Barry Schwartz and I have done, we call such wise and courageous souls the canny outlaws, the canny outlaws. They're the exceptional lawyers in the mega law firms, the exceptional cops in dispirited and militarized police forces, the exceptional teachers at public schools and universities who bravely try to practice well in spite of the system. These canny outlaws are really important. They can be critical pinpoints of light. They keep alive a tradition. They can reach out and inspire others to do the right thing. But they often do their work at great personal cost, because to quietly subvert the unwise authorities, they're often forced to work overtime. They take on extra stress. They risk being crushed by the very culture and institutions in which they work, just like Judge Forer, who was driven out because she was forced to do the wrong thing. So, had we infinite time, which we don't, I have great stories about canny outlaws, but at this moment I want to emphasize another character, another kind of person that some of you also know, one we call the system changer. Unlike the lone canny outlaw, the system changers struggle to redesign the whole institution they work in so that the institution encourages the learning of wisdom and character as opposed to crushing it. So let's just take a moment and we'll step back into another courtroom, this time in Buffalo, New York, and this time with Judge Russell. The defendant, Gary Pettengill, is standing before the judge, and the judge, Russell, says, "Hi, Gary, nice to see you. Why not give me an update?" Gary says, "My family and I moved into a new home." "That's good news," said the judge. "How do you like it?" "Pretty nice," said Pettengill. "Different neighborhood, pretty quiet, a lot bigger than before, more room for the kids to play inside." So, why is a judge having this conversation with a drug offender like Pettengill? It's because Judge Russell is the judge in a special court, in a veterans court. It's a court that aims to balance punishment and rehabilitation, which is what wise judges are supposed to do. Pettengill, it turns out, was a 23-year-old veteran. He had a severe back injury in Iraq and was forced to take a medical discharge. He was married, he had a third kid on the way. He suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and nightmares, and he started using marijuana to ease the symptoms. Only able to get part-time work and unable to buy food or put baby formula at $20 a shot on the table at home, he also started selling marijuana. He was busted in a drug sweep. A New York judge in a normal court, following normal mandatory sentencing requirements, would have had to sentence Pettengill to serious prison time as a drug felon. Pettengill's family would have been kicked out of their apartment, and the welfare system might have taken his kids away. But Pettengill was in a veterans court which at that time was the first of its kind inside the United States. It was a court that Judge Russell had designed. To build the new system, he mustered support from local prosecutors, from the VA, from social workers, from other vets. All of them agreed non-violent offenders like Pettengill shouldn't be thrown in prison because they didn't have the work to support their families and get medical assistance. Doing that would resolve nothing. These people would just revolve in and out of the prison systems probably for the rest of their lives. All agreed with Russell's plan to create this special court. The court became a national model. In fact, by a few months ago, there were 135 such veterans courts in major cities all over the United States. 108 vets completed the program in Russell's court by 2010, and the number who came back through the revolving door, 0. My final example, in transition to Joe's talk, is to talk about medicine and medical school. Jerome Lowenstein, a doc at NYU Medical School, wanted his students to learn empathy. he knew quite rightly that empathy was at the heart of good practice. It's at the heart of practical wisdom. If you can't understand what somebody else is thinking and feeling, if you can't listen well, you're not going to be able to figure out how to diagnose them, and you're certainly not going to be able to figure out how to treat them, and you're certainly not going to figure out how to get them to actually do what you say when you're treating them, especially if it demands some kind of a behavioral change. So, Lowenstein organized a weekly seminar on humanistic medicine at NYU Med School. He remembers once asking his seminar students, "Do you think you can teach compassion?" He says there was an uncomfortable silence. Then a young intern, in a voice that conveyed both anger and shame, said, "Dr. Lowenstein, I don't know if you can teach compassion, but you surely can teach the opposite." What the student meant, said Lowenstein, was that there was a disconnect between what he taught in the classroom and what doctors actually modeled in the hospital wards. There was barely enough time to visit and care for patients, let alone teach the students that were shadowing them. The only focus was on the underlying pathophysiology. How patients understood and responded to their illnesses was rarely discussed, and the house staff often cautioned the young medical students against becoming too involved with their patients. Dr. Lowenstein was a canny outlaw. He tried to use his one seminar on humanistic medicine to ameliorate the corrosive effects that medical school were having on his students. But the problem was systematic and widespread. For example, there was a huge study done at Jefferson Hospital at the med school in Philadelphia. Dr. Hojat and his colleagues decided they would measure the changes in empathy among 456 students as they moved through 4 years of medical school. The researchers found a significant decline in empathy during the third year, the so-called clerkship year, which is actually the first year that these students actually start seeing patients. Empathy, a key building block for wise medical judgments. If they lack it, you're not going to be a good doctor. Hojat found that this corrosion of empathy among students who came in idealistic, empathetic, wanting to learn judgment, this corrosion was widespread across medical schools in the United States. In fact, in a 2010 survey here at Dartmouth medical students, it found the following. 93% of the students in the medical school agreed that empathy is a necessary characteristic to the practice of responsible medicine. 64% of them worried about becoming cynical or less empathic. And get this, 71.5% of the fourth-year students, the final year students, felt they were more cynical than in the first year. So in a small community hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a team of Harvard Medical School doctors decided they were going to do something about this. Not be canny outlaws, but try to change the system. With the strong support of the then dean, Malcolm Cox, and two doctors, Dr. Barbara Oger and Dave Hirsch, there was an effort made to totally restructure the third year of medical school, the clerkship program. The reformers determined that the students' early experiences in the wards that third year was what was corroding, not encouraging character and wisdom. Rushed residents attending physicians, the briefest personal contact with patients, no continuity or follow-up, bad modeling, little mentoring, no coaching. So the new program assigned each third-year student to work with one doctor every morning in their outpatient clinics instead of in the hospital wards. The afternoons they would go to the wards. So Monday, you worked with one doctor in internal medicine. Tuesday morning, the whole morning, you worked in a pediatrics clinic, same doctor. Not only one-on-one with the same doctor mentor, but also one-on-one with patients. In fact, each third-year student was assigned 15 patients to work with for the whole year. Michael Morse was one of the students we worked with, examined and treated his patients under his mentor's watchful eye every time they came into the clinic. In fact, Anytime one of these 15 patients visited any clinic in the hospital system, Michael's beeper went off and he went to accompany them. Michael and his fellow students experienced what it means to actually care for a patient. And the close relationship with each clinic doctor allows the time for serious, ongoing mentoring. They're doing what's called problem-based learning, but the actual problem gives the students the clinical and ethics experience they need. They're dealing with an actual problem, a real person, a real case. Trial and error learning is built into the program. It's part of the structure. Michael explained, you propose things that might be mistakes, and the experienced doc catches you. If you've never had responsibility for a patient, you've never had the experience of almost making a mistake and the learning that comes from figuring out why you almost got it wrong. The data showed that the students in this program did equally well on their med boards, and their levels of empathy went way up. In fact, 10 years after, it's now the 10th anniversary actually, 10 years after the clerkship year, their levels of empathy was still higher than that of other Harvard medical students who didn't go through that program. Let me conclude. We can design experiences that encourage wisdom to be learned. It demands creating a safe space where students can learn through trial and error. It demands teaching them the skills of reflectiveness and mindfulness so that they can notice what doesn't work and try again. It demands our being good role models. It demands our being conscious that we're modeling all the time. The students are always watching us, watching our every move. And it demands that we have the time and will and experience to do the coaching and the mentoring. None of this is rocket science. It's the way many of you in this room learned to play sports, or learned to play music, or even learned how to garden. But change is difficult. Entrenched ways of doing things, even the wrong things, pose powerful barriers. It's hard to win over colleagues who are overworked and somewhat recalcitrant. It's hard to win over administrators that are conservative and focused on the bottom line. Here at Dartmouth, as we speak, there's a major effort going on to reform the medical school curriculum. Not surprisingly, it's struggling against deeply embedded cultural obstacles, the weight of the old way of doing things, and a pretty serious financial crisis that the med school is going through right now. But what is amazing is how far it's gone. Dr. Tim Leahy, the system changer in chief, my moniker for him, not his, has organized working groups to redesign the curriculum. They not only want student docs to have scientific knowledge and technical skills needed to be first-class physicians, but also to gain the habits and skills, the practical wisdom needed to be compassionate, patient-centered doctors. I've been closely observing one of the working groups this last year, the Ethics and Humanities Work Group, which is chaired by Bill Nelson, and which has already begun to integrate these elements into the current courses. But these reform efforts are not starting from scratch. They're building on the shoulders of system changers who've been working for years at the Dartmouth Med School to create a curriculum that encourages the formation of wise and caring doctors. Not so much a formal curriculum, but a powerful informal curriculum that's often hidden from view. And for over 3 decades, the doctor-educator who has been at the heart of these efforts and who wears his heart on his sleeve is Dr. Joe O'Donnell. Joe? Go to it.
Thanks, Ken. Nice job. Well, thank you all. I can't tell you what an incredible honor it is for me to share the podium with Ken. Last year, when I talked at this symposium, I read his book and actually spouted from his book about practical wisdom. And to meet him in person over this year and to work with him closely has been an unbelievable privilege. Now we're bonded for life. And the other person who came back into my life was one of my earliest students. I got here in 1978, and Dan Lucy was in the class at that time. And it's such a privilege for a teacher to see what a student does over time, and to hear from Dan and to know that he's out there on the front line fighting, using his practical wisdom to fight against the Ebola epidemic, which is incredibly scary. It's so gratifying to me as I knew him back when. I'd like to start my remarks, though, myself by talking about my own journey, a little bit about my own journey to practical wisdom, and with a quote from Marcel Proust that says, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeing new landscapes, but in having new eyes." And I can actually remember the time exactly when I developed my new eyes. It was early on in my time in the dean's office at the medical school when President Jim Friedman invited Professor Bob Coles from Harvard to actually do the convocation address. And he asked me to bring a bunch of medical students to have lunch with him, to have breakfast with him before he spoke. And afterwards, I stayed with Dr. Coles. We became very close friends. He became a mentor to me. But what he did is he opened for me a whole new world. I had gone to Harvard College, and I had been mostly a math and science major. As a matter of fact, I shied away from any course in which you might have to talk in or have to write papers in. I can still remember my roommates coming back and talking about the wonderful things they were learning in Henry Kissinger's course. But I was so afraid to go there because you'd have to write papers and talk, and oh my gosh, math and science were comfortable to me. But Dr. Coles came up and opened this whole side of me, which was hidden and important to me. It was about humanities. Dr. Coles actually won the Pulitzer Prize for documenting the experiences of the kids that were involved in busing, a book called Children in Crisis. And he came back to take over Eric Erickson's course at Harvard. His two most famous books, I think, one was called The Call of Stories, A Witness to the Moral Imagination. Another one was called The Call of Service, became my mantra. And his theory of experience, service, when with the reflection, doing as a part of learning became what was really important to me. It opened up a whole new vision for me. One of my other great gurus is a man named Parker Palmer. And as I read more of his work, and what I'd recommend to you is a book of his called A Hidden Wholeness, I began to realize that what was really important to do is try to live a life that was divided no more. Parker Palmer talked about, in order to be really a good practitioner, a good teacher, a good researcher, what one had to do is put the whole self into it. Not only the head and the hand, but also the heart and the soul. And we had to pay as disciplined attention to the education of the heart and the soul as we did to the head and the hand. Palmer illustrated this actually by talking about how movement started. And the example par excellence he talked about was Rosa Parks. So Rosa Parks was a seamstress, a woman seemingly without power, who got on a bus one day, and they asked her, would you please move to the back? And her response, which seemingly happened in just a second, was, you may do that. And she actually became divided no more. Her values and her actions became resonant and consonant just by that action. You may do that. She was saying no jail of bricks and mortar and steel was any different than worse than the jail I was conspiring to be in myself by conspiring to be part of this system that was diminishing me as a person and as a human being. And all of these people who began movements had this divided no more moment. And people thought, well, was it because you disliked the institution or hated the institution you were trying to change? And it really wasn't that at all. It was because they loved the institution so much that they didn't want to see it degenerate to its lowest form. So Rosa Parks really loved the institution in the United States. Nelson Mandela loved the institution of South Africa, and these moments of being divided no more. Well, my moment of being divided no more came with Dr. Coles opening up this vision of doing as a part of learning, service as an important thing. And at that point in time, I began to connect our medical students with service opportunities in the Upper Valley. Such by the 1990s, we had 100% of students at the medical school doing service, and they averaged 6.5 opportunities during their 4 years of medical school here. It was truly stunning. It was amazing. And we took a great deal of pride in what our students were doing out in the community, and they were learning practical wisdom by serving other people, using literature and things like this to reflect about it. We began to bring them to the Hood Museum to learn how to not only look but to see, to use the music department, to learn to listen a little better. So the medical humanities opened up a great deal of things for me. Parallel to this and going on at the same time was something I hadn't been quite aware of. When I was in Boston in medical school, there was a physician and nephrologist named Bill Schwartz, who was a renowned nephrologist, a great teacher. His son, Kenny, unfortunately had a type of cancer called small cell cancer of the lung, and he died at age 49. What he had experienced, though, at Mass General Hospital was unbelievably compassionate care, particularly from the nurses. And what Kenny did was he donated his estate to actually found something called the Schwartz Center in Boston. And that center began to fund what we'll call compassionate care rounds. We were one of the early adopters here at Dartmouth. In the pediatrics department, Schwartz rounds began probably 14 or 15 years ago. These rounds had cases, and then the people, the providers that took care of them in these cases, not only the doctors, but the nurses, the whole range of people, and then a period of reflection about what it really meant. How do you develop compassionate care? The outcome of Schwartz rounds has been unbelievable, with more teamwork promoted, less burnout, a whole bunch of really more empathy, a whole bunch of positive things happening because of that. A little bit later, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, a surgeon from the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital, who I had known, he was also in charge of the ethics curriculum at Harvard Medical School, came up here to retire in Woodstock, and he came over to see me and said, you know, I know you got Schwartz rounds going on in kids right now. Why don't we do Schwartz rounds in adults too? And so we got another grant from the Schwartz Center to begin these compassionate care rounds in adults. And again, to try and change the culture of the medical center here, to focus on this type of thing. Well, that's when I first met another one of my Virgils, people who are leading me through the abyss. And that's a man named Pano Rodas, who is the facilitator for the Schwartz rounds in both pediatrics and adult services. And as we began to talk, we started to say, why don't we do these for medical students? And we had a natural time. We send medical students in their third year off to 6 clerkships. They do surgery and medicine and pediatrics and OBGYN and family medicine and psychiatry. But there's a time in between each one when all 6 can come together. It's called the interdisciplinary clerkship experience. And so he said, why don't we have Schwartz rounds during those periods of time? And I think they were enormously successful. We'd have students come back, and they'd talk about the cases they'd experienced that demonstrated either compassionate care or ways to improve compassionate care. They were wonderful. We got screwed up because we changed our curriculum, and we have now some 6 weeks and some 8-week clerkships, so we no longer have this natural time between clerkships to do Schwartz rounds in the third year. But that's a long story. Pano and I sort of said, though, why don't we begin earlier? And the Schwartz Center had an opportunity to apply for a grant to actually bring these Schwartz types of rounds within the first and second year. And on our website at the Geisel School of Medicine, it says, our commitment is to connect hearts and minds to transform lives. And so we said, why don't we try and do that? And so what we did is brought in cases and the interprofessional teams dealing with them, with Pano facilitating the conversations. They would be connected to what was going on in the curriculum at the time. So for instance, when the students in the first year were studying chromosomes, and they were studying the embryology of how the heart develops, we brought in a mom and her daughter who had Down syndrome. And all of a sudden, trisomy 21 became real to them. All of a sudden, the embryology of the heart, because Hope, the daughter, had a congenital heart defect. And all of a sudden, all the mess of taking care of how do you tell a mom that the child has Down syndrome? How do you tell a mom you have to wait till they get a little bit bigger in order to do the heart operation that she needs? And so all of a sudden this became real, and they began to reflect on this. The second case we brought in was a kid with cystic fibrosis, and the team that took care of cystic fibrosis. This is when they were studying the development of the lung. And the wonderful thing about that is the kid who runs track for Hanover High actually had the students put on his compression jacket that he puts on every morning before school to raise his secretions so he can actually function during the day. And again, he goes out and runs track. And so every student got this tactile feeling of what it's like to be this kid with cystic fibrosis. And that becomes important because later on the students began to realize that these experiential things, if we could get them into our curriculum, that would be a good way to learn about stuff. And so one of the students, when we were studying starvation and food insecurity, had this idea about some of the students would actually live on food stamps for a week. And we compare those students to the students who didn't do this and see if the attitudes and the knowledge and things were different. And surely they were much different. So this experiential learning became really important. Anyhow, we went on to have Schwartz rounds or connecting hearts and minds rounds in all the 4 years. One of the things the students told us were you were trotting out all these things to us, though. You were telling us about patients who had anxiety, or patients who needed to be told bad news, or this or that and the other thing. How do you help us have the skills to deal with this? And so we evolved the course to then involve mental health professionals who would help teach some of these skills. And we now call it the psychology of illness, providers, and patient. And we think about it as the gate swinging out towards the patient and what they're experiencing, but also swinging inward towards ourselves and thinking about what we're experiencing as we try to care for these patients. One of the things that sort of became very apparent to me last year, and actually I was involved in an article that came out in the Opinionator piece in the New York Times called Medicine's Search for Meaning. We at Geisel had been involved in a course that a woman named Rachel Remen had run throughout the country called The Healer's Art, and it was in many medical schools, playing to rave reviews. The subtitle of it is Medicine's Search for Meaning, and actually that was the subject of this article in the New York Times. That article put a focus on this whole business of medicine and meaning and what were we doing, such that the letters to the editor about this article were more than any other article last year in the New York Times. And they actually took those letters and they wrote a second piece that appeared in October of last year called Who Will Heal the Doctors? But it got me very interested in this whole business of meaning and how do you stimulate meaning within medicine? One can tolerate almost any how if one knows the why. No need is so compelling as the need we all have for our lives to make sense, to have meaning. We will tolerate almost any degree of austerity or risk in this indomitable quest for meaning. Well, last September I also met a man named Vic Strecker, and he works at the University of Michigan, and actually his job is to run an institute that tries and changes behavior. And Vic had a daughter that actually ended up passing away from varicella, chickenpox-associated myocarditis of her heart. So chickenpox affecting the heart, causing congestive heart failure. She actually received a transplant. She didn't die till she was 21. But Vic really learned a whole bunch about changing behavior and thinking about things, had an epiphany. And one of the things that he came to the conclusion of is that we were doing things the wrong way. We were saying, you smoke, therefore you're going to get lung cancer, and therefore you're going to die. And the arrow was in this direction here. And as he thought about it, and the issue is that about 80% of the diseases we tend to have are related to our behaviors. If we could really change behaviors, we can do an enormous thing to help prevent disease. But what Vic came to the realization, maybe the arrow should be going in this way, that we're going to die. Maybe if we could live a life that has meaning and purpose, we wouldn't do these stupid things. We wouldn't smoke as much or drink as much or do the things that actually eat poorly, not exercise enough. We wouldn't do the things that get us into trouble. And the awesome thing is when he went to look at this thing about meaning and purpose in life, he found out there were millions of studies that showed that those people that had meaning and purpose did better. So, for instance, there was an investigator at Ohio State named Jennifer Crocker who found that patients who wrote down about their core values versus just writing down about events in the week, who were trying to quit smoking, were 2 to 3 times more likely to quit smoking, just by focusing on why am I quitting smoking? What's the meaning of that? Patients with Alzheimer's disease who had meaning in their life took twice as long to get institutionalized as people with Alzheimer's disease of the same severity who didn't evidence meaning in their life. People who are cocaine abusers who had meaning in their life were 2 times less likely to relapse when they had meaning as if they didn't. And that's only the tip of the iceberg about the studies. And there are the studies, and then there's also some science to it too. You know, there's on the end of our chromosomes, we have these things that are called telomeres. They're sort of like the aglets at the end of our shoelaces. And as we get older, they tend to fray, and when they do, the chromosomes tend to unravel, just like our shoelaces would tend to unravel. And there's an enzyme we have called telomerase, and actually there's a woman at University of California, San Francisco, who won the Nobel Prize for studying telomerase. But she looked at the telomerase level in people who had meaning in their lives or were mindful, and the telomerase level in those people was much higher than the telomerase level in people that didn't have this meaning and purpose in their life. So meaning's related to longevity, freedom from disease, and maybe we are looking at it in the wrong way. Another study I think was unbelievable about meaning or related to meaning is this. People say there's many types of happiness, but 2 of the types are one that's called hedonic happiness. And hedonic happiness is sort of he who has the most toys wins. I'm happy because I got a lot of stuff. And eudaimonic happiness is I'm happy because I give of myself to others. And people can be happy hedonically or eudaimonically, but if you measure some of their immune markers, their inflammatory proteins, those people that are eudaimonically happy, giving outside themselves to others, have much lower levels of inflammatory proteins. These inflammatory proteins are associated with us getting coronary artery disease, cancer, a whole bunch of other bad outcomes. So again, eudaimonic, hedonic happiness, meaning, purpose, there's something to it. If meaning was a pill, you know, and you've all seen those warnings about the pills we take and all the bad side effects, the side effects of the pill that could produce that produce meaning, warning, may reduce a meaningless life, may produce chronic gratitude, forgiveness, innovation, better sex, creativity, more friends, stronger family, productivity, giddiness, eudaimonic happiness. So all of those things seem to be important if we can produce meaning in our lives. And I think the programs that we're trying to do are trying to produce meaning in our life. And another big word we use is resilience. And the resilience is like the green twig, the green branch that will bend but not break. And there's a whole bunch of factors that are related to resilience. They're actually using this within the Green Berets, within the Special Forces right now, to try and promote resilience. But there's a whole bunch of factors. Some of them are, I'll name them, optimism, facing your fear, having spiritual resources, social support, having mentors, having rock-solid values, physical and mental exercise, being flexible and adaptable. But the most important one is having meaning and purpose. You know, so I started to talk about this at our orientation program with our medical students. We have a bunch of special forces guys in the first year of medical students. And usually they don't listen to me, but they were raptly attentive to what I was trying to say. And they knew what I was talking about. They knew when they were out in the situation in Afghanistan and Iraq and the various places they are, that they needed to have attentiveness, the situational awareness, mindfulness. They needed to have meaning and purpose. They needed to have social support, good communication. So one of the things we did during orientation this year is we asked the students to think about what types of things they wanted to have meaning in their lives. And so the first day I asked them, what word would you want to have said about you when you finished your career as a doctor? And they all wrote on an index card one specific word, and we collected them and made them into one of those wordles, where the ones they said the most appear the biggest. The second day, we asked them, what word would you want to describe somebody who was taking care of your loved ones, someone who was taking care of your parents or your kids? So they passed them in. We put them on a Wordle document. The third one was the Stephen Covey exercise. Supposing you were driving around and all of a sudden noticed this church up ahead of you that was full of people. And it turned out you pulled up to it, and it was way in the future now, and it turned out to be your funeral. You didn't know this, but it was your funeral, and you're sort of standing at the back where one of your colleagues or one of your patients was saying things about you. What word would you want them to say about you? And we again produced another Wordle. The Wordle, the word compassionate was the biggest word on all of them, but there were things like big words: caring, genuine, dedicated, passionate, selfless, committed, good. You know, those are the things that the students said that they wanted about them. The second exercise we're going to do next week is each of the students is actually going to write their living will. And it's not to think about death. It's to sort of think about what do you want in your life that can be full of meaning, and as you live these many more years in your life in medicine, what are the things you want to say that will give you meaning and purpose in your life as they do that? So I just wanted to close with one story, and then why we're trying to teach compassion. And the story was actually from an article in Academic Medicine called Winter Counts. They have these humanities in medicine parts of the journal Academic Medicine. And the article called Winter Counts, Geese Flying Over was a story of an old Native American teacher. And he talked about a thing that the Plains Indians have as the seasons turn and the geese are flying south. The elders of the tribe do winter counts. They count the geese going over. And they record these on buffalo hides. And it really is about a rite of passage. It's about passage of that year from the tribe. Well, the government bureaucrats were coming and saying, you know, these don't make sense. You know, they don't make, you know, there's not the same numbers. And the Native Americans would say to them, you know, you don't get it. You don't get it. You know, it's not about numbers. It's not about how many geese fly over. We're not trying to get accurate numbers of it's about stories. It's about our lives. It's about this year. It's about bigger than that. He made a presentation, the native teacher, to a group of people in New Orleans who we felt didn't get it either. And afterwards he said, what keeps us together are our stories and our compassion. What keeps us together are our stories and our compassion. And in the commentary about that was done by a nurse who ran a homeless clinic down in Washington, D.C., said and the whole time she was doing her nursing, she was worrying about the supplies, you know, the number of IV bottles and these types of antibiotics, and was this clinic space full, and all this kind of stuff. But really, when it came to her winter counts after she retired, she realized that what really she remembered about her experience there was the stories and the compassion. What held us together was our stories and our compassion. And back to Dr. Cole's and my transformation to be divided no more, stories were really important, stories and compassion. And what we've been trying to do is promote compassion. And just to read from the grant we submitted, compassion is hardly just a feeling. It's a core active centering force which in the first place has always been a principal motivator and raison d'etre for persons in healing roles, from Hippocrates to shamans, EMTs to clergy members, physicians to mental health workers. If we are not motivated by the desire to alleviate others' suffering, why would we enter into the worlds where others bring their suffering for cure or alleviation? Secondly, compassion is crucial to a range of intellectual competencies, such as active inquiry, deep listening, ethical decision-making, clinical discernment, management of the social elements, which are omnipresent in medicine. Every patient comes to us with a social history, a social milieu, a family, and management of the mental and interpersonal aspects of medicine. 80% of the morbidity and mortality in the U.S. are due to behavioral causes. 30 to 50% of primary care visits are due to mental health complaints. An untold number of medical cases become complex and difficult to manage due to mental health, social, cultural, and familial factors. Finally, compassion contributes as a centering philosophy to the cultivation of what might best be called discipline, or a constant practice that constructively links the indistinguishable eternal life of the provider, turning inward, to the person's tasks and responsibilities, which comprise the complex external worlds of medicine, from the battlefields to the cancer wards, from the pediatrician's offices to the neonatal intensive care units, from the city streets to the rural trailer parks. It is this kind of pervasive, unifying discipline that constitutes the core of what the American Medical Association calls professionalism. And just one last thought. When the Greeks actually made their temples to medicine, their temples to Asclepius, the god of medicine, in the center of those temples was the Greek goddess of love. Love is at the center of medicine. That's what we've been trying to teach. That's the practical wisdom we've been trying to embed in the culture of the medical school, in the culture of the medical center, and we're going to keep trying to do that. So thank you.
We'll take questions for about 10 minutes, and we'll start with Mr. Reynold, whose last name I always mispronounce.
Professor Sharpe, if you were a geographer and flew over Dartmouth, you'd see two huge silos. One's administrative and one is academic, and the only problem that the administrative people have is the academics. Of course, the academics, the only problem they have is the administration. And then inside each of these huge silos, a whole series of other silos, sub-silos. How do you get rid of those?
Can you restate that?
So if I understood your question correctly, sir, in brief, it was that in academic settings like this, you have the administrative silos, or you have silos, which you shouldn't have in the first place. So academic and administrative silos.
And then inside each you have a geography department, a political science department is different from the government department is different.
So even within these large silos, you have individual silos. So how do you get them to work together in the most effective?
How do you get rid of all the silos?
How do you get rid of all the silos, which would be the ultimate solution? Yes. So.
I can give a try to it from the medical side of things, because one of the things we've been trying to talk about is interprofessional team. You know, medicine is done in teams, but it's practiced in silos, you know. So, in fact, how do we get the doctors and the nurses and the respiratory therapists in the different cultures? How do we get those cultures together? And we're trying like anything, and we're trying, you know, to understand each other and bring people together with common aims, realizing what skills they have against a problem, putting the problem in the center rather than pitting one thing against the other.
I think that's also similar for efforts made at universities and colleges to at least minimize the silo effect. Getting rid of it is really difficult. There was a time in academia where there weren't so many subjects and there weren't so many silos. just to take the social sciences, political science, economics, sociology weren't different disciplines. They were the same discipline. And in some sense, some of the same factors that led to fragmentation and specialization in the medical world led to that kind of fragmentation and specialization inside the academic world. Then you had people who had interests, financial interests and historical interests in keeping that specialization, in creating fiefdoms. There's a lot of power involved, which is, I think, part of the frustration I hear in your voice, that it seems like so difficult to break these things down. So I'm not sure if you broke them down, some kind of a silo or system wouldn't get recreated right in the aftermath of breaking it down. What Joe's suggesting, which I think a lot more could be done with at universities, is actually, if not eliminating the silos, or breaking down the walls between them. In colleges, that's often done with programs in interdisciplinary studies and with faculty seminars. One of the joys I had this year was to attend an ongoing faculty seminar in humanities and medicine, which brought together people from the English and philosophy and religion departments at Dartmouth with people from the medical school. Does that break down the silos? No, there's still a problem. But I think a first step toward any effort in the direction you're thinking is to be able to create enough of a common language and a compassion around a common purpose that will get people to stop showing why they're different from each other and getting them to work together on common problems, as the teams in the medical school do.
Thank you.
I have a question for the first speaker. I was wondering if you've studied the effects of practical wisdom in different cultures or different institutions across the world.
So the question is basically whether Professor Sharpe has studied the effects of practical wisdom in different cultures in different parts of the world.
Read about but not studied. I wouldn't pretend to say anything elegant or eloquent about those. But at the heart of your question, I think there's a really important point, which is the importance of context and culture in terms of what wisdom is. That wisdom doesn't, and that's why I'd like another advantage of thinking about it as practical. It's about working in the particular contexts. So in the brief discussions that Dan Lucy and Joe and I were having before we came here, we were actually talking about his work in Sierra Leone in terms of delivering public health. You've got to make lots of choices and balance lots of problems, like caring for your healthcare workers, preventing the spread of the disease, curing the people that have the disease. It actually turns out that those three things, all of which are good, are in conflict with each other. The things you do to do one can stop you from doing another. But you're doing that in a different institutional and a cultural structure where people are suspicious, they have different traditions. They're not our traditions, but they dramatically affect how people are going to react to something that we may think is a standard and obvious procedure. So the kind of wisdom that it takes to work in that culture demands people with experience in that culture, because it's not going to be a portable wisdom that we bring from the United States and put onto that culture. And if you want global ways to see that, you can just see the lack of wisdom that's exercised when you assume that political institutions that work in the United States will work in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, it's the failure to understand what's at the heart of your question, I think, that's the cause of so many difficulties. The way judgment and wisdom has got to be culturally and historically rooted.
Yes, ma'am.
So that brings up a point for me, Ken, because you talk about the conflicting goods.
Right.
And so when you made the comment earlier about, we learn how to do soccer, we learn how to garden, I didn't agree with you there because that, there's no conflicting goods. I guess maybe if you're worried about the ants and then you want to have nice flowers. But with your example with Luke and your example with the judge, those were major conflicts that in the case with the judge, the prosecutor had very different values. And so he was following his thing and she had a different thing. And so it was making me think about not just how you teach, but the what, the formation, the content that, like, what was it in Luke's upbringing, or what was it in the judge's upbringing that caused each of them to navigate those conflicts in a way that was different than others? And I'm wondering if they were asked that, or if you look at that, you know, where someone's coming from, what's the content, what's been their formation, and as perhaps normal people who aren't as religious anymore don't have that aspect of information, what do you offer as other ways to get that?
That's a really terrific and very difficult question. But to take the judge case, it wasn't just the conflict between the way the prosecutor was looking at rules, mandatory sentencing, and Judge Forer was looking at the context. She also, and any judge has to do this, punishment, retribution, rehabilitation, defending public security are all three important things that have to be involved in sentencing for any judge. Those are different. They're in conflict, just like the things I was saying were in conflict in Dan's work. How to balance those in the particular case is difficult. So even absent the prosecutor, it's actually difficult to figure out how to resolve those. So the kind of, the question I hear you asking, and if I think I've got it right, is how did people like, on the one hand, it's how do people like Judge Forer learn to do that kind of balancing act? And then the more difficult question that you're asking me, if I'm hearing it correctly, is how do people who are experts, doctors, teachers, or whatever, how do you teach that to another generation? How do people learn that? And here's where I think we make a great mistake in most of our learning institutions, that we think we can lecture about it. We think we can teach it by simply giving people books to read, or that you can teach people principles and they can just apply the principles in some simple way. But inside that word application of the principles, it's actually application of those principles in this conflicting situation, in this particular context with these people. So the skills of actually learning how to be compassionate, for example, to take Joe's examples, there's not a formula for being compassionate, because understanding and caring for different people who want different things, who need different kinds of help, you actually have to be able to read those people. It's not just, well, I know what I would want, so I'm going to give it to them. I think the only way you can learn that, first of all, I don't think you can teach it generally. I don't think we could give an education, for example, at the college, so that all the graduates who went to law school or medical school or became engineers or became social workers or international aid workers, they would have the wisdom and they would go out and apply it. I think you can teach students at a college how to be wiser students and wiser friends and wiser fraternity members and wiser athletes. I think you can teach that. You can hope that the way you teach it will then have an impact, that if you teach skills like reflectiveness or mindfulness, so you're conscious of what you're doing, a kind of ability to admit and understand the mistakes you're making, the kind of courage or resilience to try something again, you could actually teach that you could, I don't think we do, you could teach that in an institution like a college. If people learned those skills when they went into new arenas where they were practicing, they'd still have to learn about the context and the details. But I think those general skills would help them. It wouldn't tell them what to do, but would enable them to learn from the experience. So if you flip around learning from filling your minds with information and passing exams to actually learning how to read a context, to empathize, to discern a situation, to weigh and balance things, that it's legitimate to fail, that you learn through trial and error. If you actually learn those things, you're teaching people the character and skills where they can then not apply wisdom when they leave, but actually learn what wisdom looks like in the particular specialty or practice. How am I doing? Is that?
So just about 3 o'clock, so we'll have to, just one more question, then one more question, and another question.
Right here, right here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir, please.
So this is a very important gathering for me. This is my second. So the practical and the reflective. I've had an experience in the last 21 days as the last dean of Lebanon College here in town. And, well, now it's 98, so this is a very important space for me. This is my home. Oh, no.
Yeah, that would, it would actually help us here to hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to first of all thank everybody. This is a very important gathering for me. I'm the last dean of Lebanon College down the road. And what's interesting is how mourning can teach wisdom also. And what you know before the event of a death, and then what you know after in the 6 weeks following, have shifted a lot of my understanding of the topics that you've been discussing. And one of the thing I wanted to share with you was the importance of gathering. This very thing that we're doing here is vital. And this is the first time I've spoken in 6 weeks about it. And I just wanted to thank this group for really imparting and reminding the longer view of what we do and why we do what we do, which is to transform lives. But sometimes in that process, that institution or those people change or circumstances change. But the things you've learned, the things you hold on to, the ones that have stuck for the faculty, the ones that have stuck for me and others are very old. They go back to Aristotle. They go back to our medieval. They go back to the trivium. The first thing I drew, the day the announcement was made, was the trivium, the three wisdoms of Oxford, and we all found ourselves drawing circles and just drawing together. And so this old wisdom that you bring to this gathering in this space, I wanted to personally thank you. Because a year ago, I had wanted to do administration and dean work and other things, and then had the opportunity in the spring to do so. And now, 6 months later, honestly, not to be dramatic, am burying a college. And I don't think I would have been able to do that without this particular gathering. So not so much a question, but more of a reflection and an inspired moment from this particular gathering today. So I thank you.
Thank you
very much for that.
Thanks, Robert.
Just as a statement about that, in the medical school, and in medicine in general, one of the things we experience, in life in general, is loss, but we really don't train people how to deal with loss. And so one of the areas that we're dealing with as a skill thing is how do we deal with loss and then do grieving, which is actually a way to heal our heart. And when we experience loss and don't do grieving, because we're trying to numb the pain, it numbs us. And when we get numb to pain, it actually goes across all the emotions, so we don't love as much, we don't do a whole bunch of things as much. And so learning to grieve is actually a skill. And loss is part of life, and it's something we don't talk about. Loss or failure, something we don't talk about enough, yet there are tremendous learning experiences from those things.
I don't think there's any way to wrap this up, so I'm just going to thank Ken and Joe and Dan for the thought and investment and time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for joining us and for your great comments and questions. We really appreciate it.